I learned that night that silence isn't the absence of sound, it's something that listens back. My name is Caleb Mercer. I was 38 years old when I took my old Volkswagen camper down into Kentucky, chasing a kind of quiet I hadn't felt since I was a kid. I'd been living too fast for too long. Deadlines, noise, conversations that never meant what people said. RV camping had always been my way out, and Mammoth Cave felt like the right place to disappear for a while. Ancient, empty, honest. I parked at a pretty primitive campground just outside the main tourist corridors, far enough that the air smelled like wet stone and leaf rot instead of propane and sunscreen. It was late, after midnight, and the cicadas had started to thin out, their chorus breaking into irregular pulses like a dying radio signal. I remember standing beside my van, hand on the sliding door, feeling that small tug in my chest that always came before a decision I'd later question. I told myself I was just restless. I told myself that's why I grabbed my headlamp, my pack, and the topo map I'd studied too casually earlier that evening. I didn't tell myself the truth, that I wanted to feel small again. The cave entrance I found wasn't on any brochure, just a low, jagged mouth hidden behind a curtain of ferns and limestone slabs, breathing out air that was noticeably colder than the summer night. That should have been my first warning. Cold air moving outward means depth. It means pressure differences. It means the cave has a body, and bodies have moods. I ducked inside anyway. At first, it was familiar. The smell of damp earth and minerals, the soft crunch of gravel under my boots. My headlamp carved a narrow tunnel of light through dark, and everything beyond it ceased to exist. That's the thing about caves. They don't threaten you outright. They erase everything else. I moved deeper, counting steps, touching the walls now and then to orient myself. The limestone felt slick, almost waxy and colder than it should have been. The temperature dropped fast, enough that my breath started to fog, hanging in the beam of my light like a second presence pacing me. I told myself I was calm. I told myself I'd done this before. Then I heard the first sound that didn't belong to me. It wasn't loud, just a soft, rhythmic thump, like a hand knocking on wood far away, muffled by layers of stone. I stopped walking and held my breath, waiting for it to repeat. It did. Steady, patient, spaced just far enough apart to feel intentional. I rationalized immediately. Water drip, rockfall settling, my own heartbeat echoing back through the passages. Denial is efficient underground. It saves energy. I followed the map deeper, though the passage narrowed more than I expected. The walls pressed closer and the ceiling dipped until I had to crouch. The air grew heavier, thick with the metallic tang of limestone dust and something else, something faintly organic, like old breath trapped in stone. That's when the smell changed. It wasn't rot or decay. It was warm, human, like the inside of a jacket that hadn't been aired out in years. I stopped again, heart tapping faster now, and swept my light across the walls. They looked the same, pale, veined, ancient. But my skin prickled as if I'd stepped into someone else's personal space. I laughed under my breath, the sounds snapping too loud in the confined space. "Get it together," I whispered, my voice sounding chuged, foreign, even to me. The passage opened suddenly into a wider chamber, tall enough to stand in. The ceiling vanished into darkness, and the walls curved inward like ribs. I felt exposed there, standing alone in a hollow that had never been meant for people. My headlamp beam jittered as my hand shook, and that's when I noticed it. The wall to my right wasn't still. At first, I thought it was my eyes. The fatigue, the way shadows play tricks when there's no reference point. But I stepped closer, slow, deliberate, and watched as the limestone surface shifted, expanded, contracted, not much, just enough, like breathing. The wall moved in a slow, subtle rhythm, outward, then back, so slight it would have been invisible if I wasn't looking straight at it. My stomach dropped, a cold, hollow sensation that spread through my limbs. I reached out without meaning to, fingers hovering inches from the stone, afraid of what I'd feel if I touched it. The air moved with it. Each expansion pushed a faint, warm current across my knuckles, carrying that same human smell. Each contraction pulled the air back, whispering softly through hairline cracks in the rock, a sound like someone sleeping nearby, unaware you're watching them. I stumbled back, boots scraping loudly, and the sound echoed too long, bouncing around the chamber until it felt like footsteps circling me. "No," I said, louder than I meant to. "No, no, no." My brain scrambled for explanations. Geological pressure shifts, temperature differentials, an illusion caused by light and shadow, anything that didn't involve the cave being alive. The wall expanded again, closer this time. Or maybe I was. My chest tightened, breath coming shallow now, and I realized with a jolt of terror that my own breathing was starting to sync with it. In, out, out. The same slow cadence as if the cave were teaching my body how to belong there. I ripped my eyes away and spun, scanning the chamber for another exit. There, behind a column of stone, a narrow passage sloping downward. Darker, tighter. The map didn't show it, but the map already felt like a lie. I hesitated. The wall breathed. I chose the passage. The descent was steep, the floor slick with moisture. I slid more than walked, catching myself on jagged edges that bit into my gloves. The sound followed me. Not footsteps, not exactly, but that same soft pressure noise, like lungs filling and emptying somewhere just behind my ears. The air grew warmer as I went down, and the smell intensified until it clung to the back of my throat. Sweat broke out along my spine despite the cold, and my thoughts started to scatter, slipping away from me like loose gear tumbling into a crevasse. I thought of my van, parked under the trees, the way the metal popped and cooled at night. The illusion of safety 4 tires and a thin shell of steel can give you. I'd never felt farther from it. The passage narrowed again, forcing me to crawl. My pack scraped the ceiling, and I had to push it ahead of me, inch by inch. The stone pressed against my shoulders, my ribs, my hips, squeezing until each breath felt negotiated. That's when the knocking started again. Closer now, louder, not echoing, localized. 3 slow taps, right behind me. I froze. The tapping came again, deliberate, patient. I didn't turn around, I couldn't. The wall in front of me pulsed, just slightly, and warm air brushed my face like a sigh. And in that moment, trapped between pressure and dark, I finally understood what the cave wanted. Not my body, but my stillness. My surrender. My agreement to stop moving forward and let it decide how this ended. Fear crested into panic, sharp and blinding, and I screamed. Not loud but raw, shoving myself forward with everything I had, skin scraping, lungs burning, mind splintering under the weight of the dark. Behind me, the cave breathed deeper. I didn't stop moving after that scream. I couldn't, because stopping meant listening, and listening meant believing what the cave was telling me. My knees screamed first, then my elbows. The limestone tore at my clothes, bit into my skin through denim and canvas, but pain felt distant, unreal, like it belonged to someone else. All that mattered was forward, away, anywhere that wasn't behind me. The passage sloped downward more sharply than before, forcing me into a half-slide, half-crawl. My headlamp beam bounced wildly, revealing nothing long enough to understand it, jutting stone, slick mineral veins, pockets of darkness that felt deeper than the rest. The air grew thicker, warmer, almost humid, and each breath tasted wrong, like recycled oxygen that had already been used by something else. Then the knocking stopped. That should have been a relief. It wasn't. Silence returned, heavier than before, pressing against my ears until I heard my own blood rushing, my pulse pounding so hard it felt external. I realized my breathing was no longer matching the wall's rhythm. It was faster now, ragged, desperate, and that terrified me even more. Somewhere behind me, something had noticed the change. The passage ended abruptly. I slammed into a low stone lip, knocking the wind out of myself. For a moment I lay there, forehead pressed to cold rock, gasping, my headlamp illuminating nothing but inches of stone. Panic surged, hot and irrational. Dead end. Trapped, buried alive with a cave that knew how to breathe. "No," I whispered hoarsely, voice cracking. "No, no, no." My hands shook as I swept the light side to side, and then there. A narrow vertical fissure, barely wider than my shoulders, dropping straight down. Not on the map. Of course it wasn't. The fissure exhaled faintly, a slow, warm breath brushing my face, like carrying that same intimate smell. The cave was offering me another choice. I didn't trust myself to think anymore. Thinking had brought me here. I swung my legs around and lowered myself into the crack, bracing my boots against one wall, my back against the other. The stone pressed into me from all sides, firm and unyielding, like hands that didn't need to let go. I descended inch by inch, muscles trembling, sweat running cold down my spine. The light from above faded quickly, swallowed by the narrowness, until my headlamp was the only thing keeping me from complete annihilation. The beam revealed walls so close I could feel their texture with every breath, pitted, scarred, faintly damp. That's when the wall beneath my hands shifted, just a little. Enough. I jerked, almost losing my footing, heart exploding in my chest. My palms pressed flat against the stone, feeling for movement, for proof that my mind hadn't finally broken. The surface felt solid, but when I held still, when I forced myself to wait, I felt it again. A slow expansion, a gentle contraction, not the entire wall, just a section, as if the cave didn't need to move all of itself anymore, just enough to remind me where I was. "I know," I whispered, tears stinging my eyes. "I know, I'm leaving." The words sounded like a promise or a plea. The fissure widened slightly near the bottom, opening into another chamber. I dropped the last few feet, landing hard, legs buckling. I lay there on my back, staring up at a ceiling I couldn't see, chest heaving, every nerve screaming. The chamber smelled stronger than anywhere else I'd been. Warm stone, old moisture, and underneath it all, that unmistakable human note, like breath held too long in a closed room. My headlamp beam cut across the floor, revealing something that made my stomach lurch. Footprints, not fresh, but not ancient either. Partial impressions in the thin layer of silt, distorted but undeniable. Bare feet, too narrow to be mine, too many to belong to just one person. They didn't lead out. They circled the chamber. I sat up slowly, dizziness washing over me, and followed the prints with my light. They looped around the space, overlapping, crossing over themselves, forming a restless pattern that made my skin crawl. Whoever or whatever had made them hadn't been going anywhere. They'd been staying. The wall opposite me pulsed faintly, almost imperceptibly, like a sleeping animal dreaming. The movement cast shifting shadows across the footprints, making them look like they were moving too. I backed away, scrambling to my feet, my mind finally snapping under the strain. Rational explanations collapsed one by one, useless against what my senses were screaming. I thought of all the times I'd ignored my instincts in the past, relationships I stayed in too long, roads I drove down because turning around felt like failure. I realized with a sick clarity that I'd done the same thing here. I'd mistaken curiosity for courage. A sound rose behind me, not knocking this time. Breathing. Deep, slow, close. I spun, light shaking in my grip, and saw the wall bulge outward, more pronounced now, the limestone surface stretching in a way stone should never stretch. Hairline cracks opened and closed with each breath, whispering softly, like lips parting to speak. The cave wasn't hiding anymore. It wanted me to see. My legs moved before my mind caught up, bolting toward a low opening on the far side of the chamber. I dove through it, scraping my shoulders, my pack snagging hard enough to nearly rip free. The breathing followed, echoing through the stone, no longer subtle, no longer patient. The passage angled upward now, forcing me to climb. My muscles screamed, hands slipping on damp rock, vision tunneling as panic reached a fever pitch. The air grew cooler with every foot I gained, fresher, and I clung to that like a lifeline. Then, faintly, another smell cut through the stone and fear. Pine. Dirt. Night air. Hope surged so fast it almost dropped me to my knees. I climbed harder, faster, ignoring the pain, the blood slicking my fingers. The breathing grew frantic behind me, the rhythm breaking, becoming uneven, angry. The walls pressed closer, vibrating faintly, as if the cave itself were resisting my escape. Light appeared ahead. Real light. I burst out of the opening and collapsed onto damp leaves, sucking in air like I'd never breathed before. The forest night wrapped around me. cool, alive, chaotic with insects and distant animal calls. I rolled onto my back, staring up at the stars, laughing and crying at the same time. Behind me, the cave exhaled one last time, a long, slow breath. Then it went still. I didn't camp another night. I didn't even clean myself up. I drove until the sky began to lighten, hands shaking on the wheel, replaying every moment over and over. The fear didn't fade when the sun came up. It settled deeper, quieter, like a lesson etched into bone. I learned something down there that no map can teach you, that the wilderness doesn't always threaten you with violence. Sometimes it invites you with intimacy. Sometimes it presses close, mirrors your own rhythms, waits for you to forget where you end and it begins. And sometimes, if you're lucky, it lets you go. But even now, years later, when I lie awake in my van and hear the wind push against the metal walls, expanding and contracting in the dark, I find myself holding my breath, waiting to see if something breathes back. I thought escaping the cave would end it, that daylight would cauterize whatever had followed me out of the dark, but fear doesn't work that way. It doesn't respect boundaries. It doesn't stop at the mouth of a cave and decide it's done with you. I drove until my hands cramped around the steering wheel, until the road stopped looking real and started feeling like another tunnel, just wider and louder. Dawn came slowly, a thin gray line cutting across the Kentucky hills, and with it came a fragile sense of normalcy. Gas stations opened, trucks passed me. A man waved as he jogged along the shoulder of the road, headphones in, unaware of how impossibly alive he looked. I pulled into a rest area and sat there with the engine running, afraid that if I turned it off, everything would catch up with me. My clothes were stiff with dried mud and blood, my arms burned with shallow cuts. But it wasn't the physical damage that kept my hands shaking. It was the certainty that something inside me had been tuned differently, like my body had learned a new rhythm. I slept in short bursts that morning, head resting against the steering wheel, dreams snapping shut the moment I closed my eyes. Every time I drifted, I felt that pressure again, that slow expansion and contraction, until I jerked awake, gasping. People came and went around me, doors slamming, engines starting, laughter floating through the air, and I felt disconnected from all of it, like I was watching life through thick glass. By the time I made it back to my campsite, the place looked harmless. Sunlight filtered through the trees, birds hopped across the gravel. My Volkswagen camper sat exactly where I'd left it, quiet and obedient. For a moment, I wondered if I'd imagined everything, if fear and exhaustion had stitched together a story too vivid to ignore. Then I opened the van door. The smell hit me immediately. Warm, stale, human. It shouldn't have been there. I'd aired the van out before the trip. I was meticulous about that. But the scent lingered faintly inside, clinging to the upholstery, subtle enough that anyone else might have missed it. I stood there frozen, heart hammering, scanning the interior for signs of intrusion. Nothing was disturbed, no footprints, no broken locks, just the smell. I backed away slowly and shut the door, my reflection warping in the metal as the panel slid closed. That's when I noticed my breathing again, slow, steady, involuntary. I placed a hand on my chest, forcing myself to breathe faster, sharper, just to prove I still could. The forest answered with a soft rush of wind through the trees, branches swaying gently, rhythmically. I packed up without lingering. Left Mammoth Cave behind me like you leave a bad relationship, without closure, without understanding, just the knowledge that staying would cost more than leaving ever could. I told myself I'd process it later, that distance would dull the edges. Distance didn't help. Weeks passed, then months. I went back to work, back to routines, back to conversations that skimmed the surface of things. I smiled when I was supposed to. I slept when exhaustion finally won. But every quiet space became a test. At night, inside the van or inside my apartment, I listened. Refrigerators hummed, walls creaked, pipes knocked, normal sounds, rational sounds, but my body reacted before my mind could intervene. My chest tightened, my breath slowed, and sometimes in the space between waking and sleep, I felt it again. Pressure. not touching me, not chasing me, just existing. I stopped camping for a while, told friends I was busy, told myself I needed a break. The truth was harder to admit that the places I once loved now felt like thresholds, and I didn't trust myself near them anymore. I'd learned too well how easily curiosity could become consent. Eventually, though, the road called me back. It always does. But I changed the way I traveled. I stayed closer to people, marked campgrounds, no unlisted trails, no caves. I trusted my instincts even when they didn't come with a clear explanation. And most importantly, I stopped pushing past discomfort just to prove something to myself. The wilderness isn't a challenge to be conquered. It's a presence to be negotiated with. That lesson came back to me one final time nearly a year after Mammoth Cave, in a place that should have felt safe, a desert campground in Arizona, wide open under a sky so full of stars it hurt to look at. I lay awake in my van, listening to the wind brush against the metal sides, the temperature dropping fast after sunset. The van expanded and contracted softly as it cooled. Metal popping, settling, normal. I focused on my breath, keeping it steady, grounding myself in the moment. But then the wind died, and in the sudden stillness, the sound changed. Subtle, almost nothing, a slow creak, then another. Timed. I sat up, heart pounding, every nerve lit. The smell was there too. Faint, familiar, impossible. I didn't turn on the light. I didn't move. I listened with the kind of attention you only learn through fear. The sound stopped. Minutes passed, then more. Finally, I exhaled long and controlled, and the van responded with a soft pop as the temperature shifted. Just physics. Just reality. My heartbeat slowed, and I laughed quietly at myself, the tension draining away. But before I lay back down, I whispered into the dark, barely audible, "I hear you." I don't know who that was for. The cave. The wilderness. Myself. What I do know is this. Fear doesn't always mean danger, but it always means information. And the night in Mammoth Cave taught me to listen without surrendering, to respect the boundary between awareness and obsession. Some places breathe, some walls move, and some experiences never leave you. They just change the way you move through the world. Even now, when I camp alone and the night presses close, I remind myself of the most important lesson I carried of that cave. You don't survive the wild by being fearless. You survive by knowing when to back away, and by never mistaking an invitation for permission. Years later, I can still tell you exactly how it feels when stone decides to notice you. Time did what time always does. It softened the sharpest edges without erasing the shape of what happened. I camp again now, not recklessly, not to disappear. I camp to remember where I stand in the world and where I don't. I still drive my Volkswagen across long stretches of American highway, still sleep with my feet pointed toward the door, still wake before dawn when the air feels different than it should. But I listen better now. That night in Kentucky didn't turn me into someone afraid of the dark. It turned me into someone who understands that darkness isn't empty. It's observant, patient. It waits for rhythm, for patterns, for the moment when a human body forgets it doesn't belong everywhere. Sometimes in quiet campgrounds, especially the older ones, carved into land that never asked for us, I'll wake up around the same hour. 1 a.m., the world always feels thinner then. Fewer insects, fewer birds, even the wind seems to hold back like it's listening for something else to speak first. On those nights I lie still and take inventory. My breath, the walls of the van, the distance between me and the earth beneath my tires. I never let my breathing slow too much. I never let it sink with anything outside of me. That's not paranoia, that's memory. Because once underground, I felt what happens when a place learns your rhythm and decides it likes it. I've gone back to Kentucky since then. Drove past the Mammoth Cave region on a bright afternoon, windows down, radio on, families lined up for tours, kids laughed. Souvenir signs promised wonder, adventure, discovery. I didn't stop. I didn't need to. Some experiences aren't meant to be revisited. They're meant to stand behind you, quiet and permanent, like a scar you only feel when the weather changes. I don't tell this story to scare people away from camping or caves or the wild places of this country. I tell it because the wilderness isn't a backdrop. It's a participant, and when you step into it, especially alone, you are entering into a relationship whether you acknowledge it or not. Respect isn't loud. It's careful. Survival isn't bravery. It's awareness. That night, the cave didn't chase me. It didn't roar or collapse or reach out with claws. It did something far more dangerous. It matched me. It mirrored my breathing, my curiosity, my willingness to stay just a little longer than I should have. That's how places like that get you. Not by force, by invitation. And if there's one thing I carry with me now, one lesson etched deeper than fear, it's this. When the environment changes its behavior around you, when the air warms without reason, when sound gains rhythm, when walls seem closer than they were a moment ago, you don't wait for proof. You leave. Because some walls don't need to move fast to close in. Some places don't need hands to hold you. And some nights will breathe with you until you forget which breath is yours. I never forgot. And that's why I'm still here to tell you this. Parked beneath open sky, engine cooling, listening to the world settle into its own rhythm, making sure mine never disappears into it again. I learned that night that silence can lie to you, and that the ground beneath your tires can remember things long after people forget. My name is Caleb Monroe. I was 38 then, and I'd spent most of my adult life trusting maps more than instincts. I grew up in North Georgia, not far from the limestone folds that wrinkle the land into sinkholes and caves, places that look ordinary until you step wrong and the earth opens its mouth. That October, I drove my old Volkswagen Westfalia down a gravel road that wasn't marked on any tourist brochure, just a pale scar through the woods leading to a clearing near Ellison's Cave. I told myself it was a simple overnight stop. Park the van, sleep, then join a small group for a controlled descent the next evening. I told myself I needed the quiet. I told myself a lot of things. The van smelled like damp canvas and cold metal when I shut the engine off. The ticking sound as it cooled felt louder than it should have, like someone tapping a fingernail on the inside of my skull. I'd camped alone plenty of times, but something about that clearing felt unfinished, like a sentence that never reached a period. The trees stood too straight. The air felt heavier than the weather report promised, pressing against my chest as if the forest itself was leaning in to listen. I cooked a simple meal on the tailgate and ate it standing up because sitting down felt like settling into something I didn't understand yet. Somewhere far off, water moved underground, a low, constant murmur that sounded almost like breath if you let your mind soften around it. I didn't let mine soften. I cleaned up, locked the van, and climbed into the pop-top, telling myself that unease was just the echo of a long drive and too much coffee. Sleep came in pieces. Every time I drifted off, the temperature dropped another degree, or so it felt. The cold seeped through the mattress and into my back, into my bones, as if the earth were pulling heat out of me slowly, deliberately. At 11:42 p.m., I woke to a sound that didn't belong to the woods. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't even loud. It was a whisper, thin and threaded with breath, rising up from somewhere below the clearing. At first, I thought it was the wind finding a new way through the trees. Then I realized the trees weren't moving. I held my breath and listened. The whisper came again, this time clearer. Not words exactly, but the shape of them. The cadence of children speaking softly, the way they do when they're not supposed to be awake yet. My mind reached for explanations like a drowning man grabs for floating debris. Animals can make human sounds. Sound carries strangely at night. Caves amplify everything. Ellison's cave sat just beyond the tree line, its mouth hidden behind a tangle of brush and rock. I'd seen photos. I knew the numbers. One of the deepest vertical drops in the continental U.S., a place where rope didn't just guide you down, it defined whether you came back up. The plan was to meet the others in the morning. I wasn't supposed to be anywhere near the entrance tonight. The whisper came again, closer now, or maybe just more focused. I felt it in my teeth, a faint vibration that made my jaw tighten. My hands were shaking when I pulled on a jacket and climbed down from the van. The cold hit me harder outside, sharp and metallic, carrying a smell I hadn't noticed before. Wet stone, old water, something faintly sweet and rotten beneath it, like leaves that had been decomposing for too long without air. I stood there, torn between the part of me that wanted to lock myself back inside the van and the part that had spent years believing that fear was a puzzle meant to be solved. I grabbed my headlamp, my boots crunching too loudly on the gravel as I crossed the clearing. Every step felt like a decision I wouldn't be able to take back. The cave entrance loomed out of the dark, not a dramatic opening, but a slumped, unassuming dip in the ground, like the earth had simply gotten tired and sunk down. The whispering seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, wrapping around my ears in a way that made it hard to tell direction. I clicked on the headlamp. The beam cut through the darkness and hit damp rock, then fell away into black. "Hello?" I called, hating how small my voice sounded. The whisper stopped. For a few seconds, there was nothing but the sound of my own breathing, too loud, too fast. Relief flooded in, thin and temporary. I told myself I'd imagined it, that exhaustion had played a trick. I was already turning back toward the van when the whisper started again. Lower this time, unmistakably coming from below the entrance. It wasn't calling for help. It wasn't saying words I could understand. It was the sound of children whispering secrets, urgent and excited, the way they do when they think they're alone. I backed away, my heels slipping on loose gravel. Panic rose up fast and hot, but it wasn't clean panic. It was tangled with something else. Curiosity, guilt, the memory of my own childhood spent exploring places adults warned me away from. I stood there longer than I should have, arguing with myself in the cold, until the whispering faded again into the stone. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in the van with the engine off, listening to the forest breathe, flinching at every creak and pop of cooling metal. When dawn finally came, it felt like an apology that didn't quite mean it. The group arrived mid-morning. 4 experienced cavers, all business, all confidence. I didn't tell them about the whispers right away. I told myself it would sound foolish, that it would mark me as the weak link before we even tied our first knot. Instead, I focused on the ritual. Harnesses checked, ropes coiled, helmets fitted. Familiar motions steadied my hands. As we approached the pitch, the air changed again. Cooler, damper, carrying that same smell of stone and old water. I glanced back at the clearing where my van sat, small and yellow against the trees, and felt a strange, sharp longing for its thin walls and familiar clutter. The cave mouth swallowed sound. Our voices came back to us wrong, flattened and distant. We anchored the rope and tested it twice. The plan was simple: descend partway, set a secondary anchor, then continue. I volunteered to go second. When my turn came, I clipped in and leaned back over the edge. The darkness below felt thicker than it should have, pressing up against my face as if it had weight. The rope slid through my gloved hands, steady and reassuring. 10 feet. 20. The beam of my headlamp caught moisture on the walls, glittering like 1,000 small eyes. At around 40 feet, I stopped, waiting for the call to continue. That was when I heard it again. Not echo, not wind, not the scrape of rope on stone. Children whispering. Directly below me, I froze, my boots braced against the rock, heart slamming so hard it made my vision pulse. I looked down, angling the light as far as it would go. The beam ended in nothing, empty air. I knew the measurements. I knew the floor was still 40 feet below where the rope ended. The whispering continued, soft and close, rising up toward me from a place that shouldn't have had a voice at all. I opened my mouth to shout a warning, but no sound came out. I swallowed hard and forced my lungs to work again, the breath rasping inside my helmet like sandpaper. The whispering didn't stop when I moved. It adjusted, sliding with me, as if whatever was down there knew exactly where I was hanging in the dark. I tightened my grip on the rope until my hands ached, the fibers biting into my gloves. "Caleb, you good?" Someone called from above. Their voice came down distorted, stretched thin by the shaft. I tried to answer normally. Yeah, I said, and hated how false it sounded even to me. The whispering dipped as if reacting to my voice, then rose again. Closer now, intimate, brushing the edges of my hearing like breath against skin. I told myself it was acoustics. I told myself caves bend sound the way water bends light. I told myself I was projecting fear into an empty hole. The words stacked up in my head, rational and tidy, but none of them touched the animal panic clawing up my spine. Continue, came the call from above. I hesitated, then eased lower, inch by inch, the rope sliding through my descender. 35 feet. 38. My boots touched nothing. The whispering intensified, no longer a background sound, but a cluster of voices overlapping, crowding each other. Still no words, just urgency, excitement, a sense of being watched and waited for. At 40 feet, the rope went slack. I stopped, suspended in space, the harness creaking softly under my weight. Below me was only darkness. I angled my headlamp straight down, sweeping the beam back and forth. No floor, no ledge, just black, swallowing light. The whispering came from directly beneath my boots now. A spike of pure terror shot through me, sharp enough to make me gasp. The sound wasn't echoing up the walls anymore. It was rising straight up as if the voices were standing on an invisible platform just out of reach, craning their necks to murmur at me. "Do you hear that?" I called, my voice cracking despite my effort to keep it steady. "What?" someone answered. A pause. "All I hear is you." Denial surged up again, reflexive and desperate. If they couldn't hear it, then maybe it wasn't real. Maybe it was trapped inside my head, some leftover nightmare bleeding into daylight. I squeezed my eyes shut for a second, then opened them, forcing myself to look down again. That's when the smell changed. It wasn't just damp stone anymore. There was a new note beneath it, stale and sour, like breath trapped in a closed room for too long. It coated the back of my throat, made my stomach twist. The whispering shifted with it, gaining texture, a wetness that made my skin crawl. I thought of my van above ground, the way its doors closed with a familiar thunk, sealing me inside a space I understood. I thought of the rope above me, the only solid line connecting me to air and light. The idea of that rope failing or being taken hit me with such force that my vision blurred. "Caleb?" The voice from above was sharper now. "You need to keep moving." I wanted to scream at them to pull me up, to abort the descent, to listen. Instead, something stubborn and self-destructive took over. Pride, maybe, or the fear of being the only one who heard ghosts. I adjusted my grip and continued down, easing myself past the point where the rope ended, into a free hang that felt like stepping off the edge of the world. The whispering followed. At 50 feet, the beam of my headlamp finally caught something, rock rushing up toward me faster than I expected. I braced, boots hitting the floor with a jolt that rattled my teeth. The rope above me swung slightly, then went still. The floor was uneven, slick with moisture. My light revealed walls that curved inward, the space tighter than I'd imagined. The whispering stopped the moment my boots touched down. The sudden silence was worse. I stood there, heart hammering, listening to the drip of water and the faint scrape of rope far above. The air felt thicker down here, pressing against my ears, my sinuses, my thoughts. I took a few careful steps, scanning the walls, half expecting to see small shapes darting away from the light. "Caleb, you're on the floor?" someone called. "Yeah," I said. My voice echoed strangely, bouncing back too fast. Floor. As the others began their descent, I tried to shake the feeling that I'd crossed some invisible boundary. The whispering hadn't vanished. It had retreated, like something patient enough to wait. The smell lingered, stronger now, clinging to the back of my tongue. When the next person reached the bottom, I watched their face closely for any sign of unease. They landed, unclipped, and gave me a quick nod, all business. No reaction. No comment. I felt a flicker of relief that died almost immediately, replaced by isolation, sharper than fear. Whatever this was, it was mine alone. We moved deeper into the cave, the passage narrowing and widening unpredictably. The temperature dropped steadily, cold seeping through my gloves and into my fingers until they ached. The walls seemed to lean in closer the farther we went, textured with ripples that caught the light and made it dance in unsettling ways. At one point, the path forced us to crawl single file through a low section where the ceiling pressed down so close I had to turn my head sideways to fit. The rock scraped against my helmet, sending vibrations through my skull. My breath grew shallow, each inhale tasting of stone and that lingering sourness. Halfway through, I heard it again, a single whisper this time, close enough that I felt it more than heard it, like a breath against my ear. I froze, blocking the passage. Panic flared behind my ribs, hot and claustrophobic. "Keep moving," someone whispered sharply from behind me, misunderstanding my hesitation. The word whispered hit me like a blow. Down here, everything was a whisper. I forced myself forward, muscles trembling, until the passage opened up again and we could stand. My headlamp beam jittered across the walls as I turned, scanning the darkness behind us. Nothing. Just rock and shadow. We reached a larger chamber not long after, a place where the ceiling rose high enough that our lights couldn't find it. The space felt wrong, too open after the confinement, like stepping into a room where the walls had been moved while you weren't looking. The air was colder here, and the smell intensified, pooling in the low spots. As we paused to regroup, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were marks on the wall. Not scratches from gear or boots. These were small, shallow impressions clustered together at about chest height, like fingertips pressed into soft clay and left to harden. They ran along the wall in a loose line, disappearing into the darkness beyond our lights. I stared at them, unable to look away. The whispering surged back, not from one direction but all around, filling the chamber with soft, overlapping breath. My skin prickled, every nerve ending on fire. "Do you see that?" I asked, pointing with a shaking hand. They followed my gesture, lights sweeping over the marks. One of them frowned. "Looks like erosion," he said after a moment. "Water can do weird things." Water doesn't leave fingerprints, I thought. Water doesn't whisper. The voices grew louder, closer, no longer content to stay just out of reach. They pressed in on my ears, my thoughts, until it felt like my own mind was fracturing under the weight of them. Panic surged, raw and uncontrollable, drowning out reason. "I want out," I said, the words tumbling over each other. "Now." The others exchanged glances, tension snapping tight between us. Protocol, pride, and safety warred on their faces. Finally, one of them nodded. "Okay," he said carefully. "We'll turn back." Relief hit me so hard my knees nearly buckled. But as we prepared to retrace our steps, the whispering shifted again, no longer curious or excited, but urgent, almost angry. The temperature dropped another notch, cold biting deep into my hands and feet. As we started back toward the pitch, I felt it then, a faint tug at my harness, so light it could have been imagination. I froze, heart slamming, and looked down. In the beam of my headlamp, just at the edge of the light, something pale withdrew into the darkness below. Not fast, not slow, deliberate. And I knew with a certainty that made my blood run cold that whatever was down there had finally decided I was real. The tug came again, stronger this time, enough to shift my weight forward. I stumbled, boots skidding on slick stone, and a sound tore out of me before I could stop it. A raw animal noise that echoed off the walls and came back wrong, layered with something that didn't belong to my throat. "Hey, what's going on?" someone shouted. "Something grabbed me," I said, and this time I didn't soften it, didn't wrap it in rational language. The words tasted like fear and metal. I felt it. Hands were on my shoulders, steadying me. Headlamps swung wildly, beams colliding and scattering across the chamber. The whispering surged, no longer subtle, filling the space with a chorus of breathy urgency that made it hard to think, hard to remember which sounds were ours and which were not. "We're leaving," the lead caver said, his voice tight now, stripped of earlier confidence. "Now. Stay close." We moved fast. Faster than safety manuals would recommend, but not fast enough to outrun the feeling that the cave was shifting around us, subtly rearranging itself. The walls seemed closer than before. the floor uneven in places I swore had been flat minutes earlier. The smell grew heavier, clinging to my clothes, my hair, my skin, as if the cave were marking us. The whispering followed, ebbing and flowing like a tide. Sometimes it faded to a distant murmur, and hope would flicker. Thin, fragile. Then it would swell again, right at the edge of my hearing, close enough that I could almost distinguish individual voices. Almost. We reached the low crawl section, the one that had scraped my helmet on the way in. Getting through it again felt impossible. Panic pressed in from all sides, compressing time and space until there was only the next movement, the next breath. Go, someone urged from behind me. I dropped to my stomach and crawled, elbows and knees grinding against stone, the ceiling pressed down inches from my back. My breathing turned ragged, loud in my ears. Halfway through, the whispering changed. It dropped lower, closer to the floor. I felt it then, something cold brushing against my ankle, light as a fingertip. I kicked reflexively, my boot striking nothing but air. The whispering spiked, sharp and excited, and for a moment I was certain I was about to be pulled backward, dragged into the dark by whatever lived just beyond the reach of our lights. Don't stop, I told myself, over and over, the words a lifeline. Don't stop. I burst out the other side and scrambled to my feet, nearly colliding with the person ahead of me. My legs shook so badly I had to brace myself against the wall to stay upright. The whispering retreated again, but not far. It hovered, waiting. The base of the pitch loomed ahead, the rope dangling down like a promise I didn't fully trust anymore. Looking up made me dizzy. The shaft seemed taller than it had before, the light from above distant and unreal. Up first, the lead said, urgency cutting through his voice. Now. I clipped in with hands that barely felt like mine, fingers numb and clumsy. As soon as my weight settled onto the rope, the whispering surged one last time, rising up the shaft with me as I began to ascend. It wasn't coming from below anymore, it was coming from the walls. Every pull sent vibrations through the rope, through my body. The whispering threaded through those vibrations, riding them upward, keeping pace. I didn't look down. I couldn't. I focused on the rhythm, pull, lock, stand, repeat, clinging to the mechanical simplicity of it. At 40 feet, something brushed my boot again. I cried out, the sound ripping free without permission. My foot swung wildly, striking empty air. The rope swayed, and panic threatened to tip me into full collapse. Above me, someone shouted instructions, firm and sharp, anchoring me back to the present. Keep climbing, they said. You're almost there. The whispering grew frantic, overlapping and urgent, no longer playful. I could feel it vibrating in my chest, in my teeth, like a swarm of insects trapped under my skin. The smell followed me up the shaft, sour and stale, until it felt like it was coming from inside my own lungs. Then abruptly, it stopped. No fade, no echo, just gone. The silence that replaced it was so sudden it nearly knocked the breath out of me. I climbed the last few feet in a daze, my mind struggling to adjust to the absence of sound. Hands grabbed my harness and hauled me over the edge onto solid ground. I collapsed there, shaking uncontrollably, staring up at a patch of gray daylight framed by rock. One by one, the others emerged, faces pale, eyes wide. No one spoke for a long moment. When we finally did talk, it was in short, clipped sentences. Logistics, safety, next steps. No one mentioned whispering. No one mentioned the marks on the wall or the way the cave had seemed to breathe around us. We packed up in silence and left. I drove away from Ellison's cave that afternoon with the windows down, cold air blasting through the van as if I could air out whatever had followed me up from the dark. The forest looked ordinary again, trees, leaves, sunlight filtering through branches, but the ground beneath it all felt different now, heavier, charged. That night, parked miles away at a crowded campground with other RVs close enough to hear generators humming, I still didn't sleep. Every time the wind shifted, I heard whispers in it. Every creak of the van settling made my muscles tense. In the weeks that followed, the sounds faded, slowly, but something else stayed. I started paying closer attention on my trips after that, not just to maps and weather reports, but to the subtle signals I'd spent years ignoring, the way a place made my skin feel, the way silence could press in or pull away. I learned that the land doesn't always announce its dangers with obvious signs. Sometimes it whispers them softly, patiently, waiting to see who listens. I still camp. I still drive that old Volkswagen into places where cell service dies and the world narrows to trees and sky. But I don't camp anywhere near deep caves anymore. And when the night gets quiet in a way that feels wrong, when the air grows heavy and the sounds don't quite add up, I leave. Because some places don't want it to be explored. Some places don't want to be understood. And some voices, once you hear them rising from below the rope, never really leave you. They just learn how to stay quiet, waiting for the next person who mistakes silence for safety. I knew something was wrong the moment the cave stopped echoing my footsteps. My name is Evan Rourke. I was 38 years old that spring, and I'd spent most of my adult life convincing myself that I understood maps, roads, and the promise that if you followed lines carefully enough, the world would stay where it was supposed to be. That belief is what led me to Tennessee. That belief is what put my old Volkswagen camper parked beneath a line of skeletal trees at the edge of the Great Basin cave system. And that belief is what nearly kept me underground forever. The night air outside the van had been sharp and mineral heavy, like wet stone rubbed against rust. I remember sitting in the driver's seat longer than necessary, engine off, hands still on the wheel, listening to the forest settle. My VW had carried me through deserts, rest stops, lonely highways that smelled like oil and dust. But this place felt different. The dark didn't just exist here. It pressed. It waited. I told myself it was just another camping stop, another data run. I wasn't alone. There were two others from the local survey team, locals who knew these caves the way fishermen know tides. That knowledge reassured me, or at least I wanted it to. I had my reasons for coming, reasons that felt logical during daylight. I'd been chasing something I couldn't name since my divorce, since the quiet of my camper stopped feeling peaceful and started feeling accusatory. Movement helped. New terrain helped. If I kept rolling, kept mapping, maybe the parts of my life that felt collapsed would reorganize themselves. That night, around 11:40 p.m., we entered the cave. The temperature dropped immediately. Not dramatically, just enough to register, just enough to make your body aware that it had crossed a threshold. My breath thickened. Headlamps cut thin cones of light into the dark, revealing walls that looked less like stone and more like muscle, veined, damp, subtly alive. The map in my hand was clean, laminated, freshly printed from a survey completed less than a year earlier. Lines crisp, markings precise. I trusted it more than I trusted my instincts. That was my first mistake. As we moved deeper, sound became unreliable. Drips echoed where no water fell. Footsteps arrived half a second too late, as if the cave needed time to decide whether to acknowledge us. Every so often, a low groan rolled through the rock, not loud, not aggressive, just present. The locals brushed it off. Natural settling, air displacement, limestone breathing. I nodded. I rationalized. I followed. By 2:10 a.m., the cave had changed its smell. The clean mineral scent gave way to something older, sourer, like wet cardboard and iron. My gloves felt tacky when I touched the wall, as if the stone had a thin film that resisted being known. That was when the first discrepancy appeared. We reached a junction that shouldn't have existed. According to the map, the tunnel we were in narrowed sharply and terminated in a rockfall. Instead, it widened, opened into a sloping passage that disappeared beyond the reach of our lights. One of the locals, Mark, laughed softly and said the map must have been outdated. Small shifts happen. Caves move. I didn't laugh. I folded the map, unfolded it again, traced the lines with my finger. I told myself this was normal. I told myself I wanted this. Discovery, deviation, proof that there were still places not fully understood. We continued. Time became abstract after that. My watch ticked, but the numbers felt decorative. The air grew heavier, warmer in patches, then suddenly cold again, like the cave couldn't decide what it wanted from us. At 3:05 a.m., everything broke. We reached a familiar chamber, one we had passed through less than 2 hours earlier. A low ceiling, a shallow pool reflecting our headlamps like black glass. I recognized the formation on the left wall, a jagged column shaped like a broken tooth. I relaxed for the first time in hours, and then I looked at the map. The chamber wasn't there. Not scratched out. Not mislabeled. It simply didn't exist on the page anymore. Where the chamber should have been, there was solid stone. No tunnels, no markings, nothing. I laughed then, a sharp, involuntary sound. I blamed fatigue, condensation, my own eyes betraying me. I wiped the laminate with my sleeve and looked again. The lines behind us were wrong too. Passages we had used hours earlier had vanished. The map now showed dead ends where we had walked freely. Loops collapsed into straight lines. Orientation twisted subtly, like a photograph warped by heat. Mark stopped talking. The other local, Jesse, kept adjusting his headlamp as if better light might fix the problem. That's when the cave went quiet. Not silent, quiet, no drips, no distant groans. Even our breathing felt muted, swallowed before it could travel. I felt it then. That internal resistance I'd been ignoring all night. The instinct that had kept me safe on roads when sleep crept in, that whisper that said, pull over, stop driving, something's wrong. I had denied it for years. Trusted logic instead. Trusted maps. The cave punished me for that. A sound came from behind us, not footsteps, not rockfall. Something rhythmic. A soft, deliberate contact. Stone touched stone in a pattern too even to be accidental. Tap, pause, tap, tap. It echoed just enough to suggest distance, but not enough to give direction. Jesse whispered my name. He didn't ask a question. He didn't need to. We turned back toward the way we'd come, only to find the tunnel narrower than before. Not collapsed, reshaped. The walls leaned inward, close enough that my shoulders brushed both sides. The air smelled wrong now, metallic, like blood diluted in water. My chest tightened. Panic rose, sharp and fast, but underneath it was something worse. Recognition, a sense that the cave wasn't changing randomly. It was correcting something, removing paths that no longer applied. I unfolded the map again, hands shaking. The map changed while I was looking at it. The lines didn't move. They didn't crawl or slide like something out of a nightmare. They simply resolved differently, as if my eyes finally caught up to a truth they'd been avoiding. Mark swore under his breath. Jesse backed away, bumping into me hard enough that I nearly dropped the map. The tapping sound returned, closer this time. Still unseen, still patient. And that's when I realized the most terrifying thing of all. The cave wasn't lost. We were. And whatever was down here knew exactly where we were standing. The tapping stopped the moment we moved. That silence felt intentional, like whatever had been making the sound wanted to know what choice we'd make next. I folded the map slowly, not because I had a plan, but because holding it open felt dangerous now, like acknowledging it gave the cave permission to change it again. "Don't trust it," Mark whispered, eyes fixed on the narrowing tunnel ahead. He wasn't talking just about the map. He was talking about everything. We moved anyway. There was no other option. Standing still felt worse than choosing the wrong direction. The tunnel forced us into single file, shoulders scraping limestone that felt warmer than before, almost body temperature. I became hyper-aware of touch, the way the rock snagged fabric, the way moisture soaked through my gloves, the way the ceiling dipped low enough that my helmet clicked softly every few steps. Each sound felt amplified, dangerous. Too much noise might wake something. Too little might mean we were already alone. My breathing grew shallow. I tried to slow it, counting steps instead. 23, 24, 25. Somewhere around 50, I realized the air smelled faintly of rot. Not decay exactly, more like something that had been sealed away too long and recently disturbed. We reached another junction. This one shouldn't have existed either. 3 tunnels branched out like broken ribs, each sloping at a slightly different angle. My headlamp caught markings on the wall, old survey chalk, faded but unmistakable. Proof we had been here before. Proof we were supposed to recognize this place. None of us did. Jesse crouched, running his fingers over the chalk like he was touching a gravestone. "This doesn't make sense," he said, voice cracking. "This section was logged, cleared, stable." Stable. The word hung there, useless. A faint breeze brushed my face, carrying that metallic smell. One of the tunnels exhaled warmer air. Another felt dead, stagnant. The third carried sound. Not tapping this time, something lower. A vibration more than a noise, like distant machinery or a throat humming just below hearing. I made a decision then, not based on logic, not based on the map, but on something older, something animal. "We don't go toward the sound," I said. My voice surprised me. Steady, certain. "And we don't follow the map anymore. We follow air. Cold air." Mark nodded immediately. Jesse hesitated, eyes drawn back to that humming passage like it was calling him personally. That fear of losing someone else hit me harder than the cave itself. I'd been alone for so long that I'd forgotten how terrifying responsibility could be. If I made the wrong call now, it wouldn't just be me paying for it. We chose the coldest tunnel. The temperature dropped sharply within minutes. My fingers went numb despite my gloves. Our headlamps reflected off frost-like mineral formations, glittering faintly like trapped stars. Beautiful. Wrong. This cave wasn't supposed to freeze this deep. The floor sloped downward, then leveled out into a corridor so straight it felt engineered. That was when the dread truly settled in. Natural caves don't do straight lines. They wander. They hesitate. This passage felt deliberate. Halfway through, the tapping returned. This time, it came from ahead. Tap, tap, pause. The rhythm matched our pace. I stopped. The tapping stopped. Mark swallowed hard. "Don't react," he murmured. "Animals test like this." But animals breathe. Animals shuffle. Animals don't wait patiently in perfect darkness, mimicking your movements with stone-on-stone precision. The air grew thick, humid again, fogging my visor. The smell changed too, less metal, more organic, like damp fur, like old sweat trapped in fabric. That's when Jesse screamed. Something brushed his leg, not grabbed, not pulled. Just contact. Enough to confirm presence. Enough to shatter denial. His scream ricocheted down the corridor, multiplied, warped. For a split second, it sounded like more than one voice screaming back. We ran. Panic took over, messy and loud. Footsteps pounded. Breath tore from my chest in ragged gasps. My pack snagged on a protrusion, yanking me backward hard enough that my shoulders screamed in pain. The lights flickered. Not failed. Flickered, as if affected by something external. Shadows stretched, twisted, rearranged themselves into shapes I refused to examine too closely. The corridor ended abruptly in a chamber that felt too large for my light to define. The ceiling vanished upward. The floor dropped away in uneven shelves of rock. And in the center of it all, fresh chalk markings. Not ours. They were neat, intentional. Arrows pointing not toward exits, but toward the chamber's heart. Toward a pit that swallowed our light completely. The tapping echoed from inside that pit now, amplified, layered. It sounded closer than it should have been. Jesse collapsed to his knees, sobbing, repeating that we'd walked this cave 100 times, that it never did this, that it never moved. That word again, moved. The truth settled into me like ice water. The cave wasn't changing randomly. It was responding to us, to choices, to fear. I pulled the map out again, against every instinct screaming not to. The laminate was cold, too cold. Frost had formed along the edges. The map showed one tunnel now, only one. A narrow line snaking away from the chamber, labeled with a notation I didn't recognize. Return path. But that tunnel wasn't visible anywhere in the chamber. "Evan," Mark said quietly. "Look at me." I did. His face was pale, eyes too wide. "We leave the map," he said, "right here. Whatever this place wants, it's tied to that thing." Leaving it felt like blasphemy, like cutting myself loose from the last illusion of control I had left. But deep down, I knew he was right. I set the map on the stone floor, watched frost creep across it faster now, the lines blurring, erasing themselves. The tapping stopped immediately. A new sound replaced it, a deep inhale, from everywhere, from nowhere. The chamber seemed to contract, walls inching closer, pressure building in my ears. Dust rained down in fine sheets. The pit exhaled a wave of air so cold it burned my lungs. And then movement. Not a creature, not a form. The cave itself shifted. A section of wall peeled away silently, revealing a tunnel that hadn't existed seconds before. Cold air poured from it, clean, sharp, real. We didn't question it. We ran again, this time with purpose, with terror sharpened into focus. The tunnel twisted violently, scraping skin, tearing fabric. My hands bled. I didn't feel it. Behind us, the cave roared, not collapsing, not screaming. Resetting. Light appeared ahead, faint, gray, impossible. We burst out into night air, collapsing onto wet leaves and mud, lungs on fire, hearts hammering so hard I thought they might break ribs. Behind us, the cave entrance stood unchanged, silent, innocent, no tapping, no sound at all. I looked down at my watch. 3:47 a.m., 42 minutes had passed. It felt like days. As dawn crept over the trees, relief didn't come, not fully. Because deep in my chest, beneath the adrenaline and shaking, something had shifted. The cave let us go, and I didn't know why. Morning didn't feel like rescue. It felt like exposure. The forest around the cave looked ordinary in daylight. Dogwoods stretching pale limbs toward the sky, damp leaves matted into the earth, birds testing the air with hesitant calls. That normalcy made everything worse. It made what had happened feel unreal, like a shared hallucination that would dissolve if we stared at the trees long enough. But my body told the truth. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. Blood had dried into the seams of my gloves. When I peeled them off, my palms were raw, skin torn in thin lines that matched the limestone's texture too perfectly to be coincidence. Jesse sat with his back against a rock, staring at nothing, lips moving silently. Mark paced, counting steps, stopping, then starting again like he was afraid stillness would pull him back underground. No one suggested going back for the map. That silence spoke louder than any argument. We reached the edge of the tree line just as the sun broke fully over the ridge, and that's when I saw my Volkswagen camper again. The sight of it should have comforted me. It had always been my constant metal and rubber proof that I could leave whenever I wanted. Instead, dread curled tight in my gut. The van was parked exactly where I'd left it, same angle, same dust pattern on the windshield, but the driver's side door was open. I knew I'd locked it. I moved toward it slowly, every sense stretched thin. The smell hit me first. Not rot, not metal, cave air, cold, mineral, unmistakable. It didn't belong up here in the sun. Inside, nothing looked disturbed at a glance. My jacket hung where I'd left it, coffee mug in the cup holder, but the temperature inside the van was wrong. Cold enough that my breath fogged faintly despite the warming air outside. Then I saw it, a folded piece of laminated paper on the passenger seat, the map. My pulse spiked so hard it blurred my vision. I hadn't brought it out. I'd watched it freeze to the stone floor. I'd watched it erase itself. Mark stood behind me now, silent. Jesse hovered a few steps back, pale and trembling. I picked the map up with 2 fingers. It was warm. No frost, no condensation. The lines were crisp again, clearer than I remembered. But they didn't show the Great Basin cave system anymore. They showed the campground, my campsite, the access road, the tree line, the exact spot where my van sat. And beneath it all, etched faintly into the laminate like a watermark I couldn't scrape away, were new lines, tunnels, passages, a network that mirrored the surface above with unsettling precision. I felt something unravel inside me then. Not panic, not fear, understanding. The cave didn't just exist beneath the land. It remembered it, reflected it, learned it. Mark whispered my name. His voice sounded far away. Evan, that wasn't there before. Jesse made a choking sound behind us. I didn't turn to look. I already knew what he was seeing. Fresh chalk marks circled the van's tires, arrows pointing inward, toward us. We didn't stay. We packed in silence, hands moving on instinct. No one suggested breakfast. No one suggested reporting anything. Some experiences resist translation. Words flatten them. Reports turn them into puzzles someone else feels entitled to solve. As I started the engine, a sound came from beneath the van. Not tapping. A low, satisfied creak, like stones settling after a long shift. The drive out of Tennessee blurred. Miles slipped past without registering. I dropped Mark and Jesse off near town without saying goodbye. None of us knew how to end that night properly. I kept driving. Days later, parked at a rest stop hundreds of miles away, I unfolded the map again. It had changed, subtly this time. New tunnels traced beneath places I recognized, places I'd slept, places I'd lingered too long. I burned it that night, watched the laminate curl and blacken, lines vanishing into smoke that smelled faintly of limestone. But here's the lesson I learned, the one that still wakes me up some nights in my camper, heart pounding, ears straining for a sound I pray I never hear again. Some places don't want to be explored. Some places don't want to be understood. They want to be acknowledged, respected, left alone. And some maps don't guide you through the world. They teach the world where you are. Since then, I don't camp near caves. I don't trust shortcuts. And when the night goes quiet in a way that feels too intentional, when the air shifts, when the ground seems to listen, I leave. Because I know now what it feels like when the land is aware of you. And I know this with absolute certainty. If you stay long enough, it will learn how to follow. I knew something was wrong the moment the dark stopped feeling empty and started feeling crowded. My name is Evan Mercer. I was 37 that summer, born and raised in western Pennsylvania coal country, the kind of place where woods aren't scenery, they're memory. I'd been RV camping most of my adult life, drifting between national forests and state parks in a faded Volkswagen Westphalia, the kind with chipped paint and a pop top that never quite sealed right. I trusted that van more than most people. It had never lied to me, never pretended to be something it wasn't. Laurel Caverns was supposed to be simple. A short overnight stay, park the VW at the primitive lot, hike into the cave system for a midnight walk. Nothing technical, nothing deep. I wasn't reckless. I told myself that over and over because part of me needed to believe it. The caves had been open all day, guided tours wrapped up by evening, and the ranger at the booth barely looked up when I told him I'd be back before dawn. Locals did this all the time, he said. Just don't go past the rope lines. The unease didn't start underground. It started in the parking lot, with the way the air smelled wrong. Not rot. Not damp, something sharp, metallic, like old batteries and wet stone. My Westphalia ticked softly as the engine cooled, metal contracting like a slow breath. I remember resting my forehead against the steering wheel for a second longer than necessary, telling myself it was just nerves. I'd been tired lately. Long drives, too much time alone. I clipped my headlamp on, checked my pack, water, spare batteries, first aid, and stepped onto the gravel. The forest swallowed sound immediately. No crickets, no wind, just that thick padded silence you get before a storm or after something big has passed through. Inside the cave entrance, temperature dropped fast. August heat vanished, replaced by a steady bone-deep chill. The beam of my headlamp cut a narrow tunnel through the dark, catching limestone walls slick with moisture. Every step echoed back at me half a second late, distorted, like someone else was walking just behind my thoughts. I kept going because that's what I always did, move forward, rationalize later. That was my pattern. Ignore the tightness in my chest. Ignore the way my shoulders crept upward like I was bracing for impact. I told myself fear was just the body rehearsing survival, nothing more. About 20 minutes in, I stopped to adjust my boot. My foot had gone numb, toes aching from the cold. I crouched, unbuckled the strap on my pack, and when I stood back up, my headlamp slipped loose. It hit the stone floor with a sharp crack, the light spinning wildly before going dark. For a second, I laughed, a short, breathless sound that didn't belong to me. I knelt, hands sweeping the ground, fingers brushing damp grit and small, jagged rocks. My pulse picked up, not panic yet, just irritation. I dropped gear before. It happens. Then the light came back on, not in my hand. Ahead of me, deeper in the cave, a beam flickered to life at shoulder height, swaying gently side to side like it was mounted on a person who had just started walking again. I froze. My first thought was stupid. Another hiker. Maybe someone else had come in late, picked up my lamp by mistake. The mind will reach for any explanation that lets it stay upright. I opened my mouth to call out, but the sound died before it left my throat. The cave swallowed even intention. The beam moved farther away, steady, deliberate, not bobbing like a handheld light, not erratic like something dragged along the ground. It walked. "Hey," I finally said, my voice thin, stretched. "That's mine." No response. I told myself not to follow. I told myself this was the exact moment where people make mistakes that turn into stories other people tell. But my spare light was still in my pack, and the darkness behind me felt suddenly heavier than the darkness ahead. I didn't want to turn my back on that moving beam. I followed. Each step felt negotiated. The cave narrowed, walls pressing closer, moisture slick under my boots. The smell changed, stronger now, coppery, like blood diluted in water. My skin prickled, every hair standing as if the air itself was charged. The beam slowed, then stopped. I stopped too, heart hammering so loud I was sure it would echo. The light tilted slightly, angling toward a side passage I knew I hadn't taken. I could see the outline now, not a body, not a silhouette, just light hovering where a head should be. "Listen," I said, trying again. "You grabbed my lamp by mistake. Just leave it." The beam dipped once. A nod. That was when dread crept in, not as panic, but as certainty. People nod with their necks, with muscle and bone. This motion was wrong, too smooth, too precise, like something copying a gesture it had only ever seen from a distance. The temperature dropped again, sudden and aggressive. My breath fogged thick in front of me, and I realized my hands were shaking, not from cold, but from the effort of staying still. The beam turned and moved down the side passage. I didn't follow this time. I stood there, alone in the dark, listening to the soft scrape of something moving without feet. The sound faded, replaced by a low hum, so faint I thought it was my own ears ringing. When I finally forced myself to unzip my pack and pull out the spare headlamp, my fingers fumbled, clumsy, refusing to cooperate. Light returned, harsh and immediate. The cave looked the same, stone, water, nothing out of place. Except the smell hadn't gone away. I backed up slowly, every step deliberate, refusing to turn around. My mind replayed the image of that beam at shoulder height, swaying like a walk, and something inside me cracked. Not fear yet, but the loss of a belief I didn't know I'd been relying on. The belief that darkness is just the absence of light, that empty spaces stay empty. Behind me, something knocked once against stone. Not loud, not threatening, just enough to let me know I wasn't imagining any of it. I broke into a run, the cave distorted with motion, walls blurring, shadows stretching and snapping back. My breath came in sharp, painful bursts, lungs burning in the cold air. The knocking followed, not chasing, not closing distance, keeping pace, as if it knew exactly how fast I was willing to go. When I burst back into the forest, the night air felt warm by comparison. I didn't stop until I reached the Westphalia, fumbling with the door, nearly dropping my keys twice before the lock finally turned. I slammed it shut and sat there back against the metal, shaking so hard the van rattled. Minutes passed, maybe more. Through the windshield at the edge of the trees, a single beam of light appeared, at shoulder height, swaying gently, like it was waiting. I didn't start the engine right away because some primitive part of me believed noise might invite it closer. The beam at the tree line didn't move forward. It didn't retreat. It just hovered there, swaying slightly, as if whatever wore my headlamp had learned patience faster than I had. My Westphalia smelled like oil and old fabric, and the faint sweetness of pine sap tracked in on my boots, smells that had always grounded me. That night, they felt thin. Inadequate, like memories trying and failing to keep up with the present. I crouched low in the driver's seat, heart thudding against my ribs, counting my breaths the way I used to when anxiety clawed up my spine. 4 in, hold, 6 out. I told myself it was another camper. Someone messing with me. A prank. People did stupid things at night. The forest encouraged it. The beam dipped again. Not toward the van, toward the cave entrance. An invitation. That was when panic finally broke through the dam. Not screaming panic, not flailing. The cold, focused kind that sharpens thought into a blade. I turned the key. The engine coughed, then caught, the headlights flooding the clearing with yellow light. Trees snapped back into place, shadows retreating. For half a second, I thought I'd beaten it, whatever it was, by choosing noise over silence. The beam vanished. I didn't wait to see where it went. Gravel sprayed as I threw the van into gear and pulled onto the access road, tires slipping before finding purchase. The forest blurred past, dark walls closing in, branches arching overhead like ribs. I drove too fast, hands white-knuckled on the wheel, every curve feeling like it might hide something stepping out into my path. 5 minutes. 10. The road straightened, and the tension in my shoulders eased just enough for the aftermath to hit. My jaw ached from clenching. My throat burned. I laughed once, short, hysterical, then shut it down. I wasn't safe yet. Not until there were lights, people, noise. I pulled into a truck stop outside Uniontown just before 1:30 a.m., parking under the harsh fluorescence near a row of idling semis. The normalcy felt obscene. Men smoking, a woman laughing too loudly, the beep of a register inside. I sat there, hands still shaking, staring at my reflection in the windshield, eyes too bright, skin pale, a stranger wearing my face. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I bought coffee I didn't drink, used the restroom, splashed cold water on my face. I told myself the cave had messed with my head. Sensory deprivation, fatigue, the brain filling gaps with monsters. That explanation fit neatly into the part of me that needed the world to stay predictable. I slept in the van with the doors locked and the curtains drawn, headlights from passing trucks sweeping across the fabric like searchlights. Every time light moved, my chest tightened. Every time it stopped, I waited for it to start again. Morning came thin and gray. I drove home on autopilot, unloading gear without really seeing it, my headlamp conspicuously absent. I told myself I'd replace it. No big deal. Gear gets lost. But the smell followed me. Not constantly. Not enough to be obvious. Just a faint metallic tang that surfaced at odd moments, opening a drawer, stepping into a cool basement, standing too long in the shower. Each time, my stomach dropped, my mind snapping back to limestone walls and that impossible beam of light. Weeks passed, then months. I kept camping, but I stayed in populated campgrounds. I avoided caves. I avoided deep woods. I learned how to rationalize avoidance as preference, fear as maturity. I told myself I'd grown wiser. Then, in October, I found the headlamp. It was sitting on the floor of the van, centered perfectly between the driver and passenger seats, as if placed there with care. I stood frozen in the open door, grocery bags digging into my fingers. I knew it was mine before I picked it up, the scuff on the casing, the cracked clip I'd meant to replace. My spare headlamp was still hanging where I'd left it. This one had no business being there. The casing was cold, colder than the air. When I flicked the switch, the beam sputtered, then steadied, bright and familiar. Relief washed through me so fast it almost knocked me over. See? My mind whispered. You panicked. Someone found it, returned it, you forgot. Then I noticed the strap. It was stretched. Headlamp straps don't stretch like that unless worn for a long time, under tension, around something wider than a human head. The elastic fibers were frayed, tiny white threads standing out like broken teeth. I dropped it. That night, I dreamed of walking behind myself through the cave, watching my own beam sway at shoulder height, listening to my own breath echo wrong. I woke drenched in sweat, the smell thick in the room, copper and stone, and something else I couldn't name. I stopped camping after that, sold the Westphalia the following spring, told buyers it ran great, just needed love. I moved closer to town, took a job that kept me indoors, built a life around light and noise and other people's voices. It almost worked. Last winter, during a power outage, I used a flashlight to check the breaker. As I turned it off, plunging the basement back into darkness, I saw it. A faint glow at the far end of the room, hovering at shoulder height, swaying gently like it was learning my house. I didn't wait to see it move. I left the basement lights off. I went upstairs. I sat on the couch and listened to my own breathing until the power came back and the world snapped into place again. Somewhere in some dark, patient space, something learned how to wear my light, learned how I walk, learned how I hesitate before following. I don't go into the dark anymore, because I know now It doesn't need to chase you. It just needs you to notice it. The worst part would be knowing it could follow me anywhere, but the truth was quieter than that. The worst part was realizing it didn't need to. After the power came back on, I sat in that living room until morning, every light blazing, television murmuring to itself, my body rigid like I was bracing for an impact that never came. When dawn finally softened the edges of the room, I felt hollowed out, not relieved, not grateful. Just emptied, like something had taken up residence in a space I used to occupy and left me standing around the edges. I told myself I would stop paying attention, that whatever I'd seen in the basement was stress, memory replaying itself under the right conditions. Darkness, silence, a familiar tool in my hand. I went to work, I spoke to people, I laughed at the right moments, I built routines thick enough to drown out anything subtle. But subtle is where it lives. It started with reflections, not full figures, never that obvious, but small delays. Turning my head and catching movement that finished half a second late in a dark window. Passing a mirror in a hallway and seeing a shoulder that wasn't quite aligned with my own. Each time, my stomach flipped, my brain scrambling to plaster over the moment with logic. I avoided basements. I avoided unlit rooms. I replaced every bulb in my apartment with the brightest ones I could find. Friends joked that I lived like an interrogation room. I let them laugh. Light was leverage. Light was control. Until it wasn't. The breaking point came in March, during a late shift at work. A storm knocked out half the city grid, plunging our building into emergency lighting. Dim, uneven, casting long shadows that pooled in corners. I felt it immediately, that old pressure behind the eyes, that sense of the dark leaning inward. I was alone on my floor and the footsteps echoing too loudly as I made my way toward the stairwell. The emergency lights hummed, a low electrical buzz that reminded me of the cave, of stone vibrating faintly with something unseen. Halfway down the hall, I smelled it again. Metallic, wet, close. I stopped. At the far end of the corridor, beyond the reach of the emergency lights, a faint glow bloomed. Shoulder height. Swaying. My mouth went dry. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to turn, to break line of sight. But another instinct, older, heavier, held me in place. The part of me that was tired of pretending, tired of being hunted by implication. The glow didn't advance. It waited. I took a step forward. My heart pounded so hard it blurred my vision, but I kept going, one foot in front of the other, the hum of the lights fading behind me. The closer I got, the stronger the smell became, and underneath its warm breath. Not mine. Stop, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. You don't get to wear that anymore. The glow flickered. For the first time it wavered, not in place, but in intensity, like it was struggling to maintain shape. I realized then what I'd been doing wrong all along. I'd treated it like a predator, something separate, something chasing me. But it wasn't chasing. It was mirroring. Every time I fled the dark, every time I surrendered a space, it learned my limits, learned where I'd retreat. The headlamp wasn't bait. It was a lesson. I took another step. The glow receded slightly, bumping against the wall as if constrained by something invisible. The air grew colder, pressing against my skin, and a wave of nausea rolled through me. I tasted copper. My ears rang. I know what you are, I said, though the words felt fragile. You're the part of me that kept walking when I should have turned back, the part that ignored the smell, the silence. You don't get to lead anymore. The glow shuddered, then elongated, stretching upward, trying to approximate height, my height. The sway became exaggerated, mocking like a caricature of my own gait. Panic surged, sharp and urgent, but I stayed rooted. If I ran now, it would follow forever. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, the screen blazing to life, white and unforgiving. The glow hissed, not a sound, but a sensation, like pressure releasing too fast. It shrank, compressing inward, light collapsing on itself until it was no more than a pinprick. I stepped forward one last time. The light went out. The darkness rushed in, thick and immediate, but it felt different now. Empty. Still dangerous. Still unknown, but no longer occupied. I stood there for a long time, phone shaking in my hand, until the emergency lights brightened and the hallway returned to its familiar, lifeless geometry. When coworkers arrived, breathless and laughing nervously, I didn't tell them what happened. I didn't need to. That night, at home, I turned off every light in the apartment. I sat in the living room, heart racing, letting the dark settle around me. I waited for the smell, the glow, the sway. Nothing came. I don't think I destroyed it. I don't think that's how things like that end. I think I took something back, a pattern, a permission. The right to stop following what feels wrong, even when curiosity, pride, or habit urges me forward. I still avoid caves. I still feel that old unease when the power flickers or the woods go quiet too fast. But now, when the dark presses in, I listen. To my breath, to my body, to the instincts I used to dismiss. Because somewhere out there, in the spaces where light ends, there are things waiting to learn how you move. And if you're not careful, they'll wear it better than you ever did. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that feels like it's listening back. My name is Evan Caldwell. I was 38 years old that winter, born and raised in southern Ohio, the kind of guy who trusted miles of road more than people and preferred the honesty of machinery to conversation. I'd been RV camping for nearly a decade by then, long enough to know the difference between danger and discomfort, long enough to believe that most fear on the road comes from ignorance, not threat. That belief is what carried me into the Cumberland Plateau on a freezing February evening, towing my old Volkswagen-based camper, boxy, stubborn, dependable, up a gravel road that felt older than maps. I told myself I was alone because I wanted to be. The truth was quieter. I'd been running from something I couldn't name, and places like this, remote, overlooked, forgotten, had a way of making me feel temporarily invisible. The campground wasn't really a campground at all. Just a clearing near a limestone ridge, no ranger station, no signage beyond a weather-beaten board nailed to a tree that said primitive use only. No cell service. No other rigs. Just forest, stone, and the weight of cold air settling into my lungs like a held breath. I parked just before dark, the plateau already swallowing light faster than it should have. The wind threaded through bare branches, making a thin, whistling sound that reminded me of breath moving through teeth. I remember thinking how sound traveled strangely there, too far, too clearly, like the woods had been hollowed out. Inside the RV, the heater kicked on with its familiar cough, the smell of old vinyl, dust, and propane wrapped around me, grounding me. I cooked a simple meal, canned stew heated on a single burner, and ate standing up, boots still on, coat still zipped. Outside, the temperature dropped fast. Inside, the walls ticked and popped as metal contracted. That's when I noticed it, the smell. At first, I thought it was damp earth, that mineral, cave-like scent you get near exposed rock, but it lingered, thickened, edged with something sour. Not rot, not animal, something human-adjacent. Sweat, maybe. Old breath. I cracked a window, let the cold in, told myself limestone country always smelled strange. Rationalization is a skill you sharpen on the road. I spent the next hour reading by a dim overhead light, the RV rocking slightly in the wind. Every so often, I'd hear something outside. Not footsteps, more like shifting weight. Snow hadn't fallen yet, so there was no crunch, no clear pattern, just the sense of movement without rhythm. I kept telling myself it was the trees. The plateau was known for sinkholes and shallow caves. Air moved oddly here. At 9:50 p.m., I heard the knock. It wasn't loud. That was the worst part. 3 soft impacts, spaced just enough to feel deliberate. Not on the door, underneath. The floor. I froze, book slipping from my hands, heart immediately loud in my ears. I stood there listening, counting seconds like they mattered. 10 passed, then 20. Nothing. I laughed once, short and forced, and crouched down. The underside of the RV was accessible through a small exterior hatch, a crawl space I'd checked earlier for storage. The knock had come from directly below the dinette. I told myself it was thermal contraction, metal shifting. Even as I said it in my head, I knew it was a lie. I pulled on gloves, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped outside. The cold hit hard, sharp enough to sting my eyes. The forest pressed close, the darkness between trees dense, almost textured. My breath fogged the beam of the flashlight as I circled the rig. Nothing moved. The hatch was where I left it, latched, untouched. No footprints in the dirt. No sign of animals. I knelt anyway, resting a gloved hand against the hatch. It felt colder than the surrounding metal, like it had been holding on to the cold longer. I hesitated, then unlatched it. The smell rushed out first, stronger now, trapped, stale, like air that had been breathed too many times. The crawl space was tight, barely 3 feet high, running the length of the RV. I swept the flashlight beam across insulation, pipes, wiring. Everything looked normal, until I angled the light upward. Handprints. They lined the ceiling. Not smudges, not dirt dragged by animals. Full impressions. Palms, fingers, even the drag of skin where someone had pulled themselves forward. Dozens of them. Overlapping, pressed into the dust and insulation like they'd been made recently. Like whatever left them had been moving through there slowly. The space was too narrow for anyone to turn around. I backed away so fast I slipped on the gravel, catching myself on the bumper. My chest burned. My mind raced through explanations and rejected every one of them. No animal made handprints. No prank fit the logistics. No rational scenario explained how someone could enter that space, move that way, and leave no trace outside. That's when I heard it again. The knock. This time it came from inside the crawl space. A slow drag followed, like skin against insulation, moving toward the hatch. I slammed it shut, latched it with shaking hands, and staggered back into the RV, locking the door behind me. My breath came fast, shallow. The heater hummed, oblivious. The walls felt thinner now, less like shelter and more like suggestion. I stood there, flashlight still in my hand, listening as something beneath me shifted its weight. The knocks resumed, irregular, exploratory, like fingers testing boundaries. I wanted to leave. Every instinct screamed at me to start the engine, to drive blind into the night if I had to. But fear does strange things to logic. I told myself if I ran, I'd panic. If I panicked, I'd make mistakes. I told myself staying still was safer. That lie lasted exactly 30 seconds. The dinette bench creaked, not from weight above it, from pressure below. The floor flexed just slightly, like something pressing upward, testing strength. My stomach dropped. I backed toward the driver's seat, keys already in my hand, when the smell returned, stronger, seeping up through vents, through cracks I hadn't known existed. And then I heard the whisper. Not words, just breath, slow, controlled, right beneath my feet. I realized then that whatever was under there wasn't trapped. It was patient, and it knew I was alone. I stayed frozen long enough for my legs to start trembling. The kind of shaking that comes not from cold, but from the body realizing it might not be in charge anymore. The whisper didn't repeat. That somehow made it worse. Silence reclaimed the RV, thick and deliberate, like whatever was under me had said what it needed to say. I stood there, keys clenched in my fists so tightly my knuckles burned, listening to the heater cycle on and off, each click sounding too loud, too final. My mind kept trying to rationalize, sleep deprivation, auditory hallucination, the acoustics of limestone, but my body wasn't listening. My body had already decided this place had teeth. I moved slowly toward the driver's seat, careful not to shift my weight too suddenly. The floor didn't creak this time, but I felt it, something subtle like pressure redistributing underneath, matching me step for step. When I reached the seat, I climbed into it without sitting, that crouched awkwardly, afraid that putting my full weight down would invite something to answer. The engine turned over on the second try. The sound shattered the silence, loud and raw, echoing off the trees outside. Relief surged through me so fast it almost made me dizzy. I dropped into the seat, slammed the gear into drive, and eased my foot onto the accelerator. The RV didn't move. For half a second, I thought I'd stalled. Then the entire rig rocked, hard, like something had shifted its weight underneath, bracing. I felt it through the seat, through the steering column, through my spine. My foot punched the gas harder. The tires spun uselessly on frozen dirt, kicking up gravel. That's when the knocking stopped. Not gradually. Instantly. The absence of sound felt like a held breath pressed against my ears. I slammed the brakes, heart hammering, and sat there, engine roaring, lights cutting pale tunnels through the trees. The woods ahead looked wrong. Too still, too flat, like a backdrop waiting to be torn down. I threw the RV into reverse. The movement came immediately. A heavy thud hit the underside near the rear axle, followed by a scraping sound that ran the length of the vehicle. Not fast, not frantic, intentional. Like hands dragging along metal, feeling for seams. I screamed then, short, involuntary, and gunned it. The RV lurched backward, tires finally finding purchase. Whatever was under there let go, or was forced to. The scraping stopped, replaced by a single, solid impact that rattled the cabinets. I didn't stop reversing until the clearing disappeared behind me and the narrow gravel road swallowed the headlights. Branches clawed at the sides as I fishtailed, barely keeping control. My mind split between steering and the certainty that I wasn't done being followed. The road wound along the ridge, sheer drops hidden just beyond the tree line. I knew better than to drive like that, knew one mistake could send me tumbling into darkness, but fear had stripped my judgment down to one rule: distance equals safety. I kept checking the mirrors, expecting to see movement, a shape clinging to the back, but there was nothing, just darkness folding in on itself. After 10 minutes, maybe more, I slowed. My hands ached from gripping the wheel. My throat felt raw, like I'd been breathing dust. The smell was still there, faint but unmistakable, lingering inside the RV like a memory that refused to fade. I pulled over at the first wider turnout I could find, killed the engine, and sat in the dark. No knocking, no whispering, just my own breathing and the ticking of cooling metal. I told myself I was safe now, that whatever it was couldn't keep up, that it belonged to that place and nowhere else. That's when the lights flickered. Just once, a brief dip like a blink. I frowned, reached for the switch, tested them again. They held steady. Probably a loose connection, old wiring. Another lie, smaller than the others, but just as hollow. I stepped outside again, this time keeping the flashlight beam wide, sweeping. The night air felt heavier here, damp, carrying the scent of wet leaves and stone. I circled the RV slowly, every nerve stretched tight. That's when I saw the handprints on the outside. They were smeared along the lower panels, faint but visible in the grime, palms pressed flat, fingers splayed. Not climbing. Holding on. One set near the rear bumper, another closer to the front wheel well, spaced like someone had been bracing themselves as the RV moved. I staggered back, bile rising in my throat. The prints were wrong. Too large, fingers too long. And they weren't random. They were placed where someone would hold on during motion. Something had ridden with me. The realization cracked something open inside my chest. A deep, cold fissure. I backed away until my shoulders hit the trees, scanning the ground for footprints, for drag marks, for anything that would tell me it was gone. There was nothing. I climbed back inside, locked the door, and sat on the floor between the seats, knees pulled to my chest, flashlight aimed at the hatch access panel like it might start moving on its own. I stayed like that for a long time, listening for any sign that the RV wasn't empty. Eventually, exhaustion crept in, heavy and unwelcome. My thoughts slowed, looping back on themselves. I kept replaying the crawl space in my head, the handprints on the ceiling, the way they overlapped, the direction they moved. Toward the front, toward where I slept, toward me. Sometime after midnight, I must have drifted off. Not sleep exactly, more like my body shutting down without permission. I woke to pressure, not sound, not movement. Pressure. The RV felt weighted, like something had settled on it, compressing the suspension. I lay still, heart pounding, listening. Outside, the wind had died completely. The forest was silent again, that same listening silence from earlier, amplified. Then came the smell. Strong enough to make my eyes water. It seeped from the vents, from beneath the floor, from everywhere at once. My stomach twisted as I realized it wasn't just human adjacent anymore. It was human. Sweat. Breath. Something old and lived in. I forced myself to sit up. The access hatch latch was turning, slowly, metal against metal, soft and deliberate, like someone who knew exactly how much pressure to apply to keep it quiet. I scrambled backwards, slamming into the cabinets, my flashlight beam shaking as it danced across the floor. The latch stopped turning. A pause. Then 3 soft knocks, right beneath the dinette again. This time I didn't freeze. I bolted for the door, that flung it open, and ran into the trees without a coat, without a plan, without even knowing where the road was anymore. Branches tore at my arms, cold bit into my skin, but I didn't slow down. Behind me, I heard metal scream as something forced its way out, followed by a sound I still can't name, half breath, half laughter, carried through the woods like a promise. I didn't stop running until my lungs burned and my legs gave out. When I finally turned around, the RV was gone from sight, swallowed by darkness and trees. But the smell lingered, clinging to me, embedded in my clothes, in my hair, in my memory. And somewhere behind me, something moved through the underbrush, unhurried, not chasing, following. I collapsed against a limestone outcrop slick with frost, my back pressed hard to stone, lungs pulling air like I was drowning on land. The forest didn't rush me. That was the terror of it. No crashing pursuit, no panicked snapping of branches, just movement, measured, controlled, somewhere behind the trees. Whatever had come out of that crawl space understood patience better than fear. It let fear do the running for it. I forced myself to stay still. My hands were numb, fingers curled uselessly inside gloves I no longer wore. My flashlight was gone, dropped somewhere in the dark during the sprint. All I had was moonlight leaking weakly through bare branches, silvering the ground just enough to remind me how exposed I was. The Cumberland Plateau wasn't dramatic here, no towering cliffs, no cinematic vistas, just low rock, shallow caves and forests that closed ranks when you weren't looking. I listened. At first, there was nothing. Then soft pressure on leaves, not footsteps, weight being redistributed, like someone crawling upright through brush without lifting their feet. I swallowed hard and pressed my forehead against the cold stone, grounding myself. Think, I told myself. Panic would get me killed faster than anything else. I knew this terrain. New limestone meant hollows, sinkholes, shallow caverns where sound traveled wrong, and people disappeared the quiet way. I also knew that predators, human or otherwise, used terrain like this to their advantage. I wasn't going to outrun it again. The movement stopped. A shape separated itself from the trees about 20 yards away. Not stepping into the open, just leaning enough for moonlight to touch it. I couldn't make out details. That felt intentional too, but I saw the posture. Low shoulders, head tilted slightly upward, like it was scenting the air. It inhaled. The sound slid across the clearing and into my chest. Not a sniff. A slow, indulgent breath, like someone savoring a familiar smell. Me. That's when the internal conflict finally broke open. Not fear of dying, but something older and uglier. The realization that I had ignored every instinct I'd trained myself to trust. I'd mistaken solitude for safety, silence for peace. I'd treated the land like a backdrop instead of an entity that demanded respect. Whatever stood in front of me now felt like the physical manifestation of that arrogance. The shape shifted again, closer this time, and moonlight caught skin. Gray. Not pale, weathered, stretched too tight over bone. The arms hung longer than they should have, fingers nearly brushing the ground even while bent. Its chest expanded and contracted with slow, controlled breaths, and when it raised its head, I saw the mouth. It smiled. Not wide, not theatrical, just enough. I didn't scream. I didn't run. Something inside me went cold and clear instead. I reached down, fingers scraping stone, and found a loose chunk of limestone the size of my palm. I wrapped my numb fingers around it and stood. The sound it made then wasn't anger. It was curiosity. I threw the stone not at its head but past it into the trees to my right. The rock cracked against a trunk with a sharp report that echoed louder than it should have. The creature's head snapped toward the sound instantly, body tensing. I ran the opposite direction. This time, I ran with intention. I headed downhill toward where I remembered a shallow ravine cutting through the plateau. Limestone shelves there, sudden drops, dangerous terrain, especially at night. But danger cuts both ways. I slid, fell, tore my hands open on rock, but I kept moving, angling toward a narrow cleft I'd passed earlier that day without much thought. Behind me, the forest finally erupted. Branches snapped, leaves scattered, not frantic, but faster now, annoyed. The ravine opened up just as my legs began to fail. I dropped into it hard, rolling, slamming shoulder first into rock. Pain flared white-hot, but I didn't stop. I squeezed into the cleft, a narrow vertical crack in the limestone face barely wide enough for my shoulders. Cold stones scraped skin as I forced myself in, twisting sideways, exhaling to make space. The movement behind me slowed again. I pressed myself deeper into the rock, chest burning, and listened as it approached the ravine's edge. Stones shifted. Dirt trickled down. A shadow fell across the opening. It crouched. The smell flooded the space, so strong it made my eyes water. I clamped a hand over my mouth to keep from gagging. Inches from my face, something exhaled, warm and damp against cold stone. Fingers brushed the edge of the cleft, testing, not forcing. It couldn't fit. That realization rippled through the air between us. The creature let out a sound then. Not a growl, not a scream. A low, disappointed hum that vibrated through the limestone and into my bones. It stayed there a long time, long enough for my muscles to cramp, for blood to dry sticky on my hands, for terror to curdle into something quieter and heavier. Eventually, the pressure lifted. The shadow withdrew. The forest swallowed the shape again, step by unhurried step. I didn't move until dawn. When the sky finally lightened, gray and flat, I crawled out of the ravine like something reborn badly. I found the road by following the slope, walking until my legs shook. A passing truck picked me up an hour later. I didn't tell the driver everything, just enough to explain the blood, the shaking, the fact that I needed to get to town. I never went back for the RV. Insurance handled the loss. Authorities chalked it up to theft or wildlife damage. No one asked about crawl spaces. No one wanted to hear about handprints on ceilings. But I know what happened. Places like the Cumberland Plateau remember us. They feel our weight, our carelessness, our belief that we can pass through without consequence. Some spaces are meant to stay tight, dark, unturned. Some things live where we aren't supposed to look, and they notice when we do. I still camp, still drive long roads, but I listen now to smell, to silence, to the subtle ways the environment pushes back when you've overstayed your welcome. And I never park over a crawl space, because some handprints aren't reaching out for help. They're measuring.